Photoshop, or how do we maybe you know these things already. It's like how do we start making things a bit better in Photoshop? I'm gonna give very kind of a broad strokes about how do we use Photoshop. Photoshop is another world, and I recommend you kind of find your own tutorials to do particular things that you think are needed. But anyway, if we do a very basic rendering, I'm going to do this small rendering with a little table there. One of the first things you need to make sure you have before you jump into Photoshop like a wild, crazy person is that you have a very good base in terms of resolution, a good base image. So taking this one the one I just did, which is a draft version, and try to make it I mean, you could do some experimental thing in good quality, but try to make a very realistic type of Photoshop final post-production with this rendering resolution. It's already a no-no. So I recommend if you're looking for high-res realistic quality, you need the best quality you can get from Revit, take it to Photoshop, and then work from there on. If you don't have quality, then whatever you do in Photoshop is just going to be diminishing the value of that image. So, but I don't have the time, so I'm going to export. You can, by the way, save the project. I'm going to export this. I recommend you don't do a JPEG. You actually do a PNG. Why? Because PNG reduces the quality, which just basically compresses the image a bit. PNG will give it its best quality as possible. You could use a PNG, sorry, the JPEG, you can use it for sending images very fast and to have a very good quality, yet a not so perfect resolution. So this, say, render one. Go to Photoshop, open. Okay. So that's the world of Photoshop. One thing I like to do is shortcut Z for zoom, and then right click and say print size, and then it goes zoom in or out, depending on, again, the resolution of your image. So if it goes very far up, let's just say you're like there, you know that image is not good. So you want to make sure that when you do the print size, that you get this biggest scale as possible. No? Another way, obviously, to see that is under image size here and understand these parameters. The resolution, the ideal resolution is the best one if you're going to do a really realistic one, which is a 300. No, so if you get an image size of 144, whatever, 150, or actually between 70 to 150, you could be good in 150, but if you go closer to 72 or 80 or so, you get in a very low resolution. You want to be in the 300s at the top. You're not going to do much beyond that point. And then obviously you need a big width and height. It could be either inches or pixels or whatever, but you need a high number in that case. Okay. You could also just zoom in and see, the level of pixelation that your image has, and say, well, this is not good enough. No way, no. So in terms of interior design, probably we're very interested in introducing elements that either are difficult to introduce in Revit or in a 3D-dimensional software, or you just do it better in Photoshop. For example, the idea of placing a person or a tree or some of those things are potentially easier and even sometimes more effective if they're done in Photoshop. I have to say that Enscape comes with people that are 3D-dimensional. They don't take a lot of memory. You can place persons, and there's an art also in how do you place 3D-dimensional bodies into your space. If you don't do it nicely, it tends to feel very stiff as an image or like mechanical, like humans are a bit mechanical in that sense, or they're a bit like sturdy or not like very humane, if you may call it. And sometimes that does not improve the quality of what you want to communicate with your image. No? So if you find that your three-dimensional bodies are a bit like that, like missing their soul in a way, you might want to just think about photoshopping the people and give them a little bit of a twist to that soul. No? But if done well, you can really have very nice results with three-dimensional bodies, especially when it comes to shadows, because as you can imagine in Photoshop, you can do a shadow by eye, more or less. You can work on the shadow infinitely and do a very good job, but it won't be so as realistic as you will get it from a three-dimensional body. Anyway, here's my son again. So what we're going to do is, first thing, well, people. So I had a web page here chosen nicely. Let me close this. This is one of trillions, and you probably already have a library with you, so I'm not going to dig into this, but you know that you can find silhouettes, people silhouettes, and you can definitely have silhouettes that are black and white, or you can find silhouettes of originals of image. Either way, I will never ask you to search for an image and try to cut the person in different ways and so on. Probably you have the web out there with the different type of persons that you need. So don't do an extra work that is not needed. Be careful with some of the images. Some of them are very like elevation wise type of persons, and other ones are more like three-dimensional, like walking from the back in, or they're literally like quite far back. So those tend to be a little tricky when it comes to shadows and so on. So just be careful with that. And with the idea of perspective, could be tricky as well. You need to make sure that silhouettes like this ones, for example, really fit well with the perspective that you have in mind. Okay. So anyway, go to any of these guys and webpage and download a library even, or just talk to a friend. Probably they have a library already. So I'm not gonna talk too much about it because I think you already know. Let me see, I don't know where I save these things. I think into the library. Here's, I have a couple of those funky persons. Okay, so when you bring a library that is good, normally you will have this thing that is white and gray background. That means that it's transparent. So you can select and move these guys away. You wouldn't be really moving them. You would just kind of displacing them. You're not cutting them away or anything. I mean, so how do we take them from one place? You can either Control A, Control C, and then come here and Control V, and then you get the same image with no background. I mean, there's other ways of moving it away. So you can, for example, right click on the image and say load selection, and then you can just say, okay, so you have that selection, and then you can also Control C and Control V. There are many ways to actually do this, but in a way you just need to bring it here. I think the Control C and V is the ideal. Now, the second you bring it, as you know, you get a new layer. You can turn it off and on. You can definitely scale it, Control T, and start modifying the scale of this. Now, here's a classic super mistake: is the idea of not demonstrating a capacity to understand scale. Now, for images that they're done, or renders that are done with a camera placed on a normal height of a human being, you always have to look at the horizon. And that's where the eyes of an adult person should be. So it doesn't matter if you put it, here or down here. You have to think of the eyes of that adult person, and then put them in the horizon, and you'll be good. Okay, so Control T, any of this work. Notice how more or less the horizon is there. As long as the eyes are more or less in the horizon. Now you have to think who's taking the camera. It may be a tall guy, then you can bring maybe this person a little bit lower, but never go far away from the horizon line. Otherwise, you have a giant in the room or a very little person in the room. A very different problem is when your camera is floating in the air and you're trying to communicate the space issue. Then it's a much more difficult issue, the idea of scale. So you're going to have to just scale back and forth depending on your understanding of scale. What I recommend is think of furniture, think of elements that are human height, and never have this kind of a conflict in terms of scale between people and furniture, because there's something that they have to be integrated. There are a couple of, there are multiple techniques, as in how many people should be in the interior space, or to be crowded with persons. That's a personal thing, and it's obviously subjective like everything, but I personally think that you need to give scale to the space, and you need to explain the basic, let's say, uses of the space. If you have like a sitting area, maybe you want to place a person sitting there. If you have a corridorial aspect, you might want to place somebody walking by. But my recommendation is not to crowd the perspectives. And another thing is, do not use this idea of the center element and scale big, no? Because it's just not respecting the spatial qualities of your space. So that's something you want to make sure. So normally tend to put them on the side and almost like passing by or using the space in a very kind of a natural way. That's what we need to find out. Now, not because you put in a lot of people, you're making the rendering better. That's, I guess, my main argument. You have to be effective as in the number you want to place, in considering the uses of that space and the scale value of that space. No more and maybe no less. Okay. What type of persons? Now, I don't know, if you have a person with a coat, and then you have this family, or it's two persons that are like wet, maybe with, I think they're wet because they're in a in a fountain or whatever. Well, there's a contradiction in that, so just be careful not to put a whatever winter type of humans with summer type of persons. That's one thing to think about. And the other one is the idea of color code. So you have, I don't know, like what is the style or the feeling that you want to communicate with the image. Be respectful of that feeling. So if you want a warm touch in that rendering, there's like based of patterns of reds and warm tones, maybe bring something that fits nicely with that. Don't bring suddenly, I don't know, like a blue sweater, or maybe, yes, you want to contrast with that with a particular dress in blue, or pants in blue, whatever it is. So just think at least what type of people, what type of style of people, silhouettes I'm bringing that convey the idea that I'm trying to convey with the project, and don't disrespect your project. Okay, and that would be the main comment. Now, as in Photoshop, you can move the persons, as I said, but imagine you have a reflective type of floor. We can do very simple things, such as duplicating that layer. Say, duplicate layer, and you can call it layer 2 reflect, and that would be there. But what we can do is Control T, right click, and then flip vertically and flip horizontally. Oops, vertically only, and then bring it on underneath. Sometimes you need to do the trick. So there's the little boy or girl could be there, and then you can take that layer, put it underneath, and maybe give it transparency. Okay, maybe you want to delete from that layer and use a brush for deleting that is like soft, round, and then maybe don't erase 100%, but whatever, 50%, and start erasing from the bottom, so that you have your simple reflection. You can obviously group these two very easily as shadows. So, I mean, you could just do simple things like a new layer. You can call it shadow, oops, whatever. And for example, do use the lasso tool and draw notice that I'm not doing anything very precise, just a little whatever thing. Maybe fill this with a black color. Foreground, okay. Oops, sorry. This needs to change to a black, and then right click, fill, okay. So that's a black thing under that layer, so on and off. And then what I can say, well, that's definitely not my shadow, that's a criminal act of the rendering. But I could, again, add transparency. There's other filters I can use, such as blur box, for example. And under small quantities, could feel like a shadow kind of thing. So notice how that's changing. And you can even start erasing with the brush that I was using before, maybe a little smaller, right click, and then start erasing some parts a little bit more than others. It's like a ghost in the floor, and that gives it a little, more of a presence, three-dimensional presence. Other things we can do, well, some people like, for example, if I go to layer 2, which is the persons, some people like some of the transparency on the people as well, so you can see a little of the architecture behind, and that way the people don't have so much presence. I call it the ghost technique. That's up to you. Maybe the pants of the baby in red are good because they fit with the table, but maybe not. So then you can use that layer, again, layer 2, and say any of the adjustments for levels or for color saturation only for that layer, no? You might want it brighter, you might want it darker. You have any of these options under adjustments that you can use, for example, hue and saturation. Again, I'm doing it only for the layer. You could say a bit more of, I don't know, orange tones because it fits with the wood. I don't know, more or less saturated. Maybe you don't want so much color and you go back to desaturating the image. Maybe you want to even blur just a bit of that particular layer of the people. So you can do just a blur element. It will make it even more ghosty. So, some people like this to tone down the tones, the colors of your persons, so the colors of the project stick out even more. I personally think it's a good idea. Notice that reflection now is just a bit too sharp, so you can get very crazy with these things, by the way. Filter, blur box, and what you do is a very small, maybe a 1. So there's a little blur that makes it even more, realistic, etc., etc. So you could go on and on and on and on, only on the position of one body. I recommend that you think about what is the style that you want. Maybe go out to Google and research on other renderings. Just say great renderings of interiors, and then think, this is the style I like. I like desaturated, semi-ghost, reflective with shadows there, whatever quality. And I'm going to use only 3 persons, one here, one there, and there. You never disturb the space that you want to communicate with the rendering. You emphasize the space, you emphasize scale, and you make sure that the main uses of that space, let's call it chair, sitting, laying down, or whatever it is that you're trying to do in the project, are well communicated through the bodies you're introducing. Okay. Great. So that's about people, but what about the rendering itself? So layer 1, the fundamental one. Well, there's actually a good one. You can duplicate this layer as well. I think it's a good technique. I'm gonna leave it like that, but you can rename them. So there's basically 2 of the same, okay? And you can do to the first one what is called a mask. that adds this little funky friend on the right. A mask allows you to paint in black and white with the brush B. I'm right clicking and reducing the size of the brush and soft round. And if you click on the little white box here and you press the left button, I don't know if you can see here what's happening in the little white box. It starts appearing like a little, like whatever I'm brushing is, I don't see it in the project. I'm seeing it only in that white board. So what it's doing is that the darker it is in that board, the more transparent it is. So I'm revealing what's behind that layer 1 copy. Now I'm not seeing anything different because layer 1 is the same. But if I turn off this one for a second and, for example, do something radical, such as hue saturation, funky, and turn on that one, let me go back and, so now I'm going to brush with the white. And again, look always at the whiteboard there. What I'm doing is now painting in white here. Okay, so let me do again, painting black on the board. If I paint, for example, the sky here, like what I'm doing is not painting, I'm revealing the image below in that particular area of the brush. So I can say, I want a bit more like a purple sky, why not? Or maybe the red you want to emphasize for whatever reason, then you might want to use the opacity. So again, what I'm doing is erasing with a brush. But the good thing about the brush that is soft round is that it's not doing very radical changes. It's softening the edges and at the same time erasing. So it reveals the layer that is behind. This is probably that technique in Photoshop that allows you to improve some areas of your rendering, like some areas in color or lighting, without being blocky in those changes, okay? It's a great technique. I definitely recommend it. You could do that as many times. You can duplicate the layer and have as many underneath the whiteboard, and you can just reveal more from one or the other one, etc. So one thing, let me just get rid of this thing. And control, I'm going back in time. Okay, so let's imagine we start. One thing I do recommend from all of you for Studio for the Future is like, before you do anything, give it a chance. Well, duplicate the layer because you never know if you're going to mess it up. If you duplicate the layer and to one of the layers, give it a chance to levels. I think it's a fundamental one. Levels, it works great to emphasize depth, and it's a bit of a brightest in contrast, but a bit smarter way. So normally I recommend pushing these two little marks towards the front until you find you're getting a bit more of a better contrast and brightness. Okay, so that's what it is now, and this is what it was. So I don't know if you see the difference, but basically it's adding a little bit more of a contrast, smart contrast. This is a bit darker, and shadows are a bit stronger, so you have a stronger sense of depth to the space. Again, by just working a bit with adjustments levels. Okay, I think it's an important. You could, one thing, as I said before, you can duplicate the layer, and the top one could have a mask, and the bottom one could have a very strong levels. Let's say here. So obviously that's probably too strong, but if you put on top of the other one, you can start coloring or using the brush on the white panel to emphasize the contrast in some areas only. They seem minimally, but I think for the trained eye, these are incredibly effective. So basically, I have a little bit of this one very strongly. Has been used, has used the levels option, and then the other one is pretty much on top. So I reveal only some parts of it. I mean, there are many other ways to, like the idea of movement for, you know, this, you can go to layers, you can have the feeling that the person is moving. So you can take this element and go to some of the filters, and there's motion blur, things like that, that you can, some people like this. I'm not a fan of it, but some people like it or not, and it gives this feeling of passing by. I would definitely use this one mostly if there's a person walking or running or whatever it is in one direction. I wouldn't use it for a more static person or figure. No. Another thing you can do is to say duplicate layer, call it person to motion, and do the filter to that. So motion blur, give it a bit more than what you like, or, and then work with those two. You can put underneath the one with the motion, turn it off, and then you can do erasing of the motion. So maybe you want to move the hand that holds the baby only, and maybe the head of the baby a bit more. So I'm erasing everything except the head and the hand. So those are the things that I think should be movement, for example. And then in the layer 2, I erase very little of the hand and the head as well. So those only are the ones moving. So I'm using, I guess, a little bit of the motion blur in one part. Maybe somebody walking, you can have the legs having motion blur more clearly or more accentuated than the head, for example, or whatever it is. No, that's a very kind of a interesting effect that is a bit more elegant because not the entire body being motion blur, but it's just the parts that are naturally moving. No, there are other blurs such as radial blur. That's, I don't know, not a fan of those. You can select an area and then you can move a lake in one direction and so on. It's a very funky way to do this. I don't know. There are a bunch of things here that you can do. Photoshop is a whole world. I do recommend once you're done with the things you're proposing or you're trying to do, that you save the file as a PSD, so you don't compress or anything, and that you actually, you know, work with it, that you keep having it, or you save it for the future, because you never know if you're going to need to do some changes. Remember that if you save as PSD, you're basically given this file, the one that has all of the layers, so you can hide something you don't like. A client or a professor might tell you, I don't like this person, and then if you actually compress the file or whatever, you're just gonna kill yourself. So make sure you save the PSD, and then when you want to place it to InDesign or whatever, you can save as, and you can choose the JPEG option. Now that render one will be much smaller in size, but you don't have the layers, so that's the main issue. Okay, you only want to do that as a way to send it or finalizing an image that you can place afterwards into InDesign or whatever it is. But I recommend, again, you keep the Photoshop file so you can keep working with every single layer in the future. Just very fast. Maybe I can open. Add another person, black and white. Some of you also like this option. You can just Control A, Control C, go back here, Control V, Control T to scale this. Again, this is more like the neutral, less detail oriented type of people, whatever. Again, the same applies in terms of scale. So make sure that the eyes in the horizon and so on. Now these are a bit more like neutral, like you don't want to bother too much picking up the ideal human. They're just, you know, hatch. No, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. So it's up to you. What do you want to do? I normally don't like a very pure black hatch. If you're gonna use this technique, I recommend that you do some transparency for sure, and maybe a bit of the blurring. Depends on how it's looking, because if it's too strong, a little bit of a blur, it's a good way to go about. But again, that's also personal. You could potentially change the color. Why not? So you could just press the W or right click with the lasso tool, and you say here free transform. Oh, sorry. Load selection, and then select the element. Say okay, and you have that selection. You can paint. Say brush and paint with the foreground color. Could be very clear color, and then you can do your thing. So you can do very simple things. I wouldn't recommend you can going very funky with that. I like the other option, like more realistic. I don't know. Depends on the project. If it's more of a, if it's also not a rendering that wants to be realistic, I would recommend the shadows or the more hatches because they're a bit more abstract. If you're going for the realistic, I would definitely recommend the more realistic persons. That's up to what style of rendering you're thinking about. Okay, I think we'll stop that.